He says the Eucharist, as Christ's saving presence in the community of the faithful and its spiritual food, is the most precious possession which the church can have in her journey through history. Right. That's a strong statement, because he didn't just say, if you listen carefully, he didn't just say the Eucharist is the best thing that God has given us. He said that the Eucharist is the best thing that God could give us. Well, God's God. I mean, that means that God couldn't make some other universe and give something better than the Eucharist. Why is that? And the reason is simple. It's because in the Eucharist, he gives us himself. And he doesn't have anything more to give. He could have made a better universe. More beautiful universe. He could have made more beautiful bodies for us. He could have made us more intelligent. He could have done lots of things that he didn't do, and we don't always understand why. But he couldn't have given us anything better than the Eucharist. And we're going to look at 3 reasons why that's the case. The Eucharist is the best thing that God could give us because it's his presence among us. Right? And so it's the same reason for the incarnation. God couldn't have done anything better in any conceivable universe than entering the universe by becoming man. And in the Eucharist, right, the night before he was to die, and he knew that he was going to rise, but he would ascend into heaven and leave us on this earth 40 days later, he didn't want to leave us orphans. And so the night before he died, he instituted the Eucharist so he could remain with us until he comes again in the second coming. Right, so and so he couldn't do anything, couldn't give us a better present than leaving us himself as he left. Right? He was going to leave with his physical presence that could be seen in which his humanity could be seen. That he was going to take up to heaven, but he was going to leave that very same humanity here on earth in the Eucharist, and he did. It's just that we can't see him in that humanity, but that humanity is really here. So that's the first way it's the best thing that God could give. There's a second reason why it's the best thing that God could give us. Because not only did he give us his presence to remain with us until the end of time, but he gave us the very act. Now this is strange. We can't do something like this. He wanted to not only give us himself and stay here while he left, but he wanted to give the very act by which he was going to die for us. In other words, his sacrifice. He didn't want to leave us without that very sacrifice by which he was to die for us. Now, we can't do anything like that. If somebody, and it happens, no, there are saints and other people who have died, soldiers who died for their country. St. Maximilian Kolbe, if you know his story, he was in a concentration camp, and somebody had escaped, and so the soldiers were randomly picking out 10 men to be starved to death. And the last of the 10 men to be chosen started to cry and said, "My family, my wife and my kids." And at that point, Maximilian Kolbe stepped forward and he said, "I want to die in place of that man, because I'm a priest, I don't have a family." And amazingly, the soldiers let him do it. And that man afterwards fell into depression because he realized, "My goodness, this saint died for me. And who am I?" But then he realized, "I have to get out of here alive to tell the world, to perpetuate his memory, the memory of that heroic act." Right, so that's the kind of thing that we maybe can do, is perpetuate the memory of somebody dying for us. But Jesus didn't want to just do that. He wanted to give to his church his very sacrificial death, the very sacrificial act by which he gives himself to the Father for us. And he wanted to give it to the church to be the church's offering every single day. And that's what we just did in church. And so that's the greatest thing God could give, right? Not only himself, but his very sacrifice to be our sacrifice. And we'll talk more about that in the last talk that I'm going to talk in Holy Week. And there's a third reason why this is the greatest gift that God could give. Not only did he want to remain with us, and remain with us as the sacrifice for our sins, but he wanted to nourish us with his very life. So he wanted to remain with us, and his sacrifice to be our spiritual food and drink. But not like ordinary food and drink, which we convert into ourselves. This spiritual food and drink, the Eucharist, converts us progressively into him, into Christ. Right? So, 3 reasons for which Christ instituted the Eucharist. Is to perpetuate his presence, to be our sacrifice, so that his very death for us would be our sacrifice today until the end of time, and to be our sacrifice and spiritual nourishment. All 3 in one. And any one of those 3 would be the greatest thing that God could possibly give. But all 3 put together make it still the best thing that God could possibly give. Yeah. So let's look at the Old Testament preparation for these 3 aspects of this one gift, the Eucharist. And it makes sense that there would be preparation because it's the greatest gift that God could give. And so if God doesn't do things without preparation. Just as he didn't come into the world 2,000 years ago without preparation. And he formed Israel for 2,000 years to be the preparation for his coming into the world. And so likewise, in the history of Israel, we get all kinds of preparations for the Eucharist. Right, so let's look at that. And so let's start by looking at the gift of his presence with us. That was prepared for in the Old Testament in all kinds of ways. In fact, even before that, it was prepared for in Eden. Because in Eden, Adam and Eve walked with God in the cool of the day. There was an indwelling, some kind of presence, we don't understand the details, of God in the garden, which was that was the glory of Eden. That was the best thing about Eden. Better than the beauty of it or even the immortality was that intimacy with God and dwelling with them. But that was lost in the fall. And so all of human history since then is marked by the longing for reestablishing an intimate presence with the Lord dwelling with us and we with him. So all of history is the history of an exile, right? The exile from Eden. And the Eucharist is remedying that because he's dwelling with us. It's just one problem, we don't see his humanity, but it's really there. And the Lord prepared for this in the Old Testament in all kinds of ways. And particularly by appearing to the Jewish people first on Mount Sinai. So when they crossed the Red Sea, they wandered in the desert to Mount Sinai, and when they got there, the Lord appeared in glory, in a cloud, with thunder, with lightning, with awesome visual, sensible appearances, to show his presence there on the mountain, and in the giving of the law. And then the Lord instructed Moses to make the Ark of the Covenant, in which his presence would dwell in a special way. And the Ark of the Covenant was a material thing, but it contained 3 precious things. It contained the 2 tablets of the law, the 10 Commandments. It contained a jar of manna, and I'll talk more about the manna later on, spiritual nourishment. And it contained the rod of Aaron, which sprouted miraculously to show that he was chosen by God to be priest. And all 3 of those things symbolize Jesus Christ, who is the living law, the living Torah, who is the living bread come down from heaven, we'll talk more about that, and who is the eternal high priest. Right? So the Ark of the Covenant was the dwelling place of God with the Israelites because it foreshadowed, it pointed to Jesus Christ. Right? But in reality, the Ark of the Covenant was a box. And it had some stone tablets and some bread, miraculous, and a miraculous branch. And the Lord dwelt there, and also in a sensible way. There was they could see a cloud of glory over the Ark of the Covenant. And the beautiful thing was that when the chosen people moved from place to place, what happened? That cloud of glory would accompany them, right? Hovering over the Ark of the Covenant, the tent of meeting. And this was the case until the Ark of the Covenant was lost at the time of the prophet, the judge Eli, because of his unworthy sons, and it got taken away and taken by the Philistines. But the Philistines wanted to get rid of it because God gave them a plague where the ark was being held by them. And so they dumped it in Israelite territory, and at that point David was king, and he brought it into Jerusalem. And there's this beautiful passage in the second book of Samuel, chapter 6, about David bringing the Ark of the Covenant into David's own city, Jerusalem, and dancing before it. And he says, "Who am I that the Lord should come to me?" Now that wasn't really the Lord, right? Because it's just a box. But it was a place where the Lord showed his presence sensibly with a cloud of glory, but it was pointing forward to what really is the Lord, Jesus Christ. Right? And then Solomon built the temple, and the same thing happened in the temple. The cloud of glory descended on the Holy of Holies, which held the Ark of the Covenant. And this is the reason why, if you read the news, you see there's a lot of, strife about a plot of land called Israel. And that's not just a political thing. Right? It's really important to understand that. That's important to Jews, not for political or temporal reasons. But the land of Israel was sanctified because God dwelt there in the temple. That's restoring, in a sense, in a figure, preparing for the restoration of what had been lost in Eden, God dwelling with mankind. But again, it's just a figure. Let me say something about what a figure is. In the Old Testament, God revealed himself through words, those we call them prophecies, where through words he tells about what he will do in the future. But he also reveals himself through events and realities. And we call those types or figures. They're real events in the life of Israel, but they point forward to Jesus Christ, to the church, to the Eucharist. Right? And that's what we're looking at tonight. So that presence of God in the temple was a beautiful type of, and it was lost. No, it was lost. That was the great tragedy of the exile. The Babylonians came and they burnt Jerusalem and they burnt the temple, and that presence of God with them was taken away. But 70 years later, the temple was rebuilt, and God descended once again on the Holy of Holies. But 40 years after Jesus' death on Calvary, the temple got destroyed again, 70 AD, and was never rebuilt, and hasn't been rebuilt to this day. And so that presence of God in the temple was lost. And Jews still mourn that every year in a special day of mourning. So we should see that presence of the Lord with his people as a type or figure of an immensely better presence that we have in every church. Right? How is it a better presence? Because, as I said before, the Ark of the Covenant, it sounds bad to speak this way, but it was just a material thing, representing a better presence. And that better presence is God made man. So when God took on human nature in Mary's womb, that's the real thing, right? That's the true temple of God dwelling with man. That's what all the prophets of Israel were longing for, and revered in a figure, the figure of the glory in the temple. But Jesus is the real temple. Right? But he lived only in a particular place 2,000 years ago, and we weren't there. And so what did he want? He wanted that presence to be available to everyone who wanted to have access to it. And so the Eucharist answers that need. Right? Even though Christ's humanity was only a particular place, Galilee, Jerusalem, 2,000 years ago, that humanity is here too. in every church and in every tabernacle. And that means that every tabernacle is a holier place, no offense to Jews, than the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Jerusalem. Because the Holy of Holies only had a figure, tablets of stone. And the Eucharist is the living bread, Jesus Christ, his true body, blood, soul, and divinity. And so it's, we could say, well, we must say, infinitely holier than the temple and than any other place on earth. And we also, as we said before, than anything that God could do in any possible universe. Right? God couldn't do anything, make anything holier than the Eucharist in every parish. But here's the problem. When something is familiar, what happens? We take it for granted, right? And we don't prize it. Whereas in the Israelites, because that presence was only in one place, in the temple, and it cost a lot of effort to go there, and they would make pilgrimages 3 times a year, they revered it perhaps more highly than we do the real thing, right? Because this is easy. But that very easiness is itself, right, that is the supreme grace of God, by which any one of us can have access every day if we choose. To God made man, prisoner for our sake in the tabernacle. Okay, let's pass now to the second reason why Jesus instituted the Eucharist. And we said it was to perpetuate his sacrifice on Calvary. And here too, we find in the Old Testament tons of types or figures pointing forward to this. And in fact, not just in the Old Testament, but from the beginning of human history. If we read Genesis chapter 4, immediately after the after the fall into original sin, the first thing we read about is Cain and Abel offering sacrifice. Right? And Abel's sacrifice being accepted and Cain's not. So that's the first the first thing that is recorded after the fall is Eve conceiving. And then the second thing is the offering of sacrifice. And then the third thing is murder. So sacrifice is a really fundamental thing. We have little appreciation for it in our culture. But in any traditional culture, sacrifice is offered to God for 2 fundamental reasons. It's offered to God to show that he, also for this reason, to be the perfect sacrifice for all the sins of human history, to make atonement for sin. Right? And he did that on Calvary. But as we said, he didn't want to just leave that a one-time event, but he wanted to give to his church a sacrifice infinitely better than all the sacrifices of mankind. So let's look at the sacrifices of mankind. In the sacrifice of, say, of Abel, he offered some created thing. In the sacrifices of the Old Testament, animals were offered and their blood. At the foot of Mount Sinai, for example, when Moses sealed the covenant with Israel, he took bulls and the blood of bulls and had poured out half of it on the altar. And then with the other half of the blood, he sprinkled the people. And so the bulls were offered in sacrifice, and the blood especially. Why? Because the blood represents the life. And so that's the most precious thing. But obviously the life of a bull is not the most precious thing. It's just bulls were offered, or rams or sheep or goats, to represent something better, a better offering. And what would be a better offering? Well, a better offering, the best possible offering, would be one that's better than all sin is bad. Could something be offered that's better than all the sin of history put together is bad? What could that be? Well, only one thing, right? The life of God made man, offered freely back to the Father for man's redemption in love. That's something more pleasing, more good, better in the order of good than all sin put together from the beginning to the end of history. Hitler, Stalin, whoever you like, Nero, put it all together. Christ's offering on Calvary is better than all that is bad. So that's the one true sacrifice that does what a sacrifice ought to do: make atonement or reparation for sin. But God prepared for that sacrifice from the beginning of history, and especially in Israel, by having the Israelites offer many sacrifices that were symbolic, that weren't more pleasing than sin is displeasing, but were pointing towards something better. Right? And that's the reason for all the sacrifices that God commanded Moses to observe in Israel. So for example, let's take some examples. When the temple was consecrated by King Solomon, he celebrated that consecration of the temple by offering sacrifice. How much sacrifice? I think it's 120,000 lambs were offered with their blood poured out. Well, that's a lot of blood. And that wasn't just a one-time thing. Every year at the Passover, something similar happened. Every group of 10, every family group, had to take a lamb, a one-year-old lamb, immaculate, and bring it to the temple and have it offered in sacrifice with its blood poured out by the priests in the temple court. And then they consumed that. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And how many lambs would that be? That would be a lot of lambs. There's a Jewish historian who lived a little bit after Jesus in the 1st century, and he wrote that in one of the last pilgrimages before the temple got destroyed, there were 1 million pilgrims in Jerusalem for the Passover. And probably when Jesus died, there were something like that, maybe 500,000 million people who saw him crucified at the Passover, because all adult Israelites, if they could, had to go to Jerusalem for the Passover. And so if every group of 10 had to offer a lamb, how many lambs would that be? Something like 100,000 lambs or 50,000 lambs. A lot, and a lot of blood. And what would be think of the spectacle that would make on the mind. All of this blood poured out year after year. And it's saying two things. It's saying that atonement needs to be made for sin, but the very fact that it's made year after year, new lambs each time, shows that the old ones weren't enough. And of course they can't be enough, because how could the blood of lambs and goats be more pleasing than sin is displeasing? Right? It isn't. But it was pleasing to God that it was offered, because it was a figure or type of the real blood that is more pleasing than sin is displeasing. Right? And that's Christ's blood poured out at Calvary. But again, we said Christ didn't want to make that something that simply happened 2,000 years. It's true, he can only die once. He doesn't die again in the Mass. But he makes himself present in the Mass in his body and blood. Right? His body and his blood truly become present in every Mass. And therefore, that very same blood that was poured out on Calvary 2,000 years ago is made present on the altar and separated from his body sacramentally in the separate consecration of the bread into his body and the wine into his blood. And that makes Christ present on the altar. It's true, Christ now is glorious, but he's present on the altar as the victim of our redemption in every Mass. Right? He's truly offered, and his blood that saved us is truly offered to God the Father in every Mass, as Father Waldman did tonight. And so just as with regard to the presence, Christ's presence in the Eucharist is infinitely greater than his presence in the temple, but at the same time infinitely more accessible. Same thing true here, right? What happened one time, Christ's sacrifice is infinitely greater than all the gold bulls and goats and rams, but they were only offered in one place. Right? In the Mosaic Law, all sacrifice had to be offered in the temple. It couldn't be offered anywhere else. And that's why Jews don't offer sacrifice anymore. They would if they could, the Orthodox. But they can't, because the temple got destroyed 2,000 years ago. Whereas, what do we have in the church? We've got the real sacrifice. The sacrifice of God made man, that's more pleasing than sin is displeasing. And where is it offered? Not just in the temple of Jerusalem, but in Florissant, in Shrewsbury, in every part of the world, wherever there's a Catholic priest who can offer it. Let's move on to the third gift. Not only did Christ want to become present with us and have that presence be his offering to the Father, but he wanted us to receive him in his whole reality. So in every Mass, two things are happening. He offers himself to the Father, and we offer him to the Father. And then he offers himself to us in Holy Communion, to receive the very victim who gave his life for our redemption, and to receive him as our spiritual food. God prepared for this also in the Old Testament in marvelous ways. And the most obvious preparation was in the desert. Right? So when they wandered in the desert, there was no food. Right? And so God rained down food from heaven, which the Israelites called manna. Does anybody know what manna means? No, it doesn't mean bread. It means, what's that? And that's important, actually. It's the Hebrew word for what? Ma. And the reason for the name is because they never saw anything like it. In other words, this is something totally new. Something that they hadn't gotten before. Something from above rather than from below. And thus it was called bread from heaven. But in reality, it was food. Right? It nourished their bodies. But in a miraculous way, not coming from the work of their hands. And there was another property. Everyone got just the right amount. It didn't matter if you gathered lots, you just received what you needed. And if you gathered little, you received what you needed. And you couldn't save it up. And then it didn't have a distinctive taste. So those people who longed for, garlic and the flesh pots of Egypt were dissatisfied. But those who had a spiritual disposition, it tasted like honey and had a marvelous sweetness. And that's why in benediction we say, having all sweetness within it, with regard. That was a type of the Eucharist. All right, so let's compare. In the Eucharist, it's, above all, the name is so appropriate, because what's that? The Eucharist is literally inconceivable, inexhaustible. If I think that I've understood the Eucharist, right, I teach a course on the Eucharist, right? But if it were to get to my head and think that I understood the Eucharist because I teach a class on it, that would be the stupidest thing on earth. We can't understand it because its reality is Jesus Christ, and he's inexhaustible. Secondly, Jesus comes from above, not from below. God made man, coming from the Father, eternally pre-existing. And so the manna came from above geographically, but Christ comes from above, from the heaven of the heavens, from the Father. The manna nourished them with physical nourishment, but Christ in the Eucharist nourishes us with sanctifying grace and charity. What does that mean? He nourishes us with his divine life and with the power to love as he is loved. But he doesn't give it to us all at once. We each get, just like with the manna, what we're disposed to receive. Right? So just as the Israelites just got what they needed, we too, when we receive communion, we receive what we can use. And that means we receive grace according to our disposition. And that's a really important thing. That means that if I come to receive communion with a great hunger and thirst for Christ and for his love and for the ability to love, I will receive much more grace than if I just go up there in a routine way. I'm distracted or not thirsting, not hungering and thirsting for Christ. So everyone receives the same Jesus Christ in communion, but everyone receives a different grace according to the state of our hearts. But we can't always taste that sweetness, again, because that too depends on our disposition and on the grace of God. to give consolation or not, as the case may be. All right? And so that's a beautiful figure of the Eucharist. There are many other figures also of the Eucharist as spiritual nourishment. And one of those is the offering of Melchizedek. We're told that Melchizedek is a strange figure. He prefigures Christ, the eternal high priest. He was a priest. And he offered bread and wine. And that prefigured the Eucharist, in which Christ is offered under the appearances of bread and wine. But what's the difference? Melchizedek offered just bread and wine. But in the Eucharist here, under the appearances of bread and wine, what is offered? Jesus Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity. So again, the type or figure falls infinitely short. And likewise in the temple every day in Jerusalem, bread and wine was offered before the Lord. Before the Ark of the Covenant, they baked bread and put loaves out. It's called the bread of the presence, is the way we usually translate it. But the Hebrew actually says the bread of the face. And the meaning is the bread put before the face of God in the Holy of Holies. But that was just bread. But nevertheless, it was offered, and only the priest could eat it. You know, and when David was hungry, and there's that episode, he ate the bread reserved for the priest. And that was a figure, again, of the Eucharist. Because in the Eucharist, what in the Old Testament, that bread of the presence that was reserved only for the priest, is offered now to all the faithful, right? To all the baptized who are in a state of grace. And so there's a broadening of God's bounty, doubly. That was just bread, and this is Jesus Christ. And that was just for some, and this is for all the faithful, in condition to receive it. And then finally, the Passover is perhaps the best figure of the Eucharist. And we already said the Passover lamb prefigured the sacrifice, and the Eucharist as sacrifice. But the beauty of the Passover was the very same lamb that was offered in sacrifice in the temple court on precisely the day that Jesus died, was also consumed by the faithful. Right? So they offered the victim, the Paschal lamb, and then they received as their food that very lamb that they offered. Just as the victim, the Lamb of God, Jesus Christ, is offered in every Mass, and then we receive the very same victim who's offered to the Father. But there's this difference. The Passover lamb, what was it? A lamb. And that's all. But what do we receive here? God made man. We receive his whole, each one of us who receive communion tonight, receive Jesus Christ whole and entire. And again, it doesn't matter if you receive a gigantic host or a tiny crumb, you receive the whole Jesus Christ. His body, his blood, his soul, which loved us to the death, his sacred heart, by which he gave himself for us, and his divinity, which gives us grace and gives us the ability to love as he has loved us, bit by bit, day by day. And so those are some of the ways that that the spiritual nourishment of the Eucharist was prefigured. And there's one last way, and that was in Eden. In Eden, there were two trees, right? There's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that they should have eaten from, but there was the other tree, the tree of life. And when they were expelled, Adam and Eve, from the garden, what was the great tragedy? That they no longer had access to the tree of life. And the tree of life represents eternal life. And that was a figure of what we, if we receive communion tonight, receive tonight. We receive the reality. We receive, think of it, John 6. How does Jesus present himself? I am the bread of life. Israelites who knew the Old Testament really well, they would have made a connection, the bread of life and the tree of life. Right? The tree of life that got barred, that whose the access to which we no longer have, is now replaced with a better thing, the bread of life. One of the fathers of the church calls it the medicine of immortality. And Jesus says in John 6, right, right, who eats this bread will not die, but I will raise him up for life eternal. Right? Because he's nourishing us with his immortal divine life. So during this Lent, here's my exhortation, let us, as a Lenten practice, try to receive the Eucharist as often as we can, and with a deeper sense of its meaning, and with some prayer about the gift that God gives us in the Eucharist. Questions? Sorry, that was kind of dense.
So, in the temple, when an animal was sacrificed and the blood was drawn, what happened to the animal?
There were different, good question. There were different kinds of sacrifices. In some sacrifices, the whole thing was burnt, and that would be a Holocaust. And that's for God alone, the Holocaust. But there were other sacrifices that were communion sacrifices, in which the people would also consume the victim, and the principal part, I think, going to the priests, but the faithful who offered it also receiving a part. And there are different kinds of sacrifice according to the different proportions. But again, all of them pointing to these two things, sacrifice and communion.
I have one question. Jesus celebrated the Passover with his disciples before he was crucified.
Right.
But at the same time, while he was being crucified, the lambs were being sacrificed
Right.
before the Passover.
Right.
So,
How does that work?
yeah.
Okay, this is actually a very difficult exegetical question. Phil, repeat the question? All right, so the question is, on Good Friday, Jesus was being crucified, it seems, when the Paschal lambs were being sacrificed, because they were sacrificed on 3 in the afternoon, more or less, of the 14th of Nisan. And it seems that in the Gospel of John, he speaks as if that Jesus being Good Friday is in fact the time in which the lambs were being sacrificed. There's a great difficulty here in how to put that together with the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who speak of the Last Supper, which was the night before, as a Passover meal. So the fact is we have to hold both things. It was a Passover meal the night before, but it seems that John is saying that it was the day before the Passover. How do we put that together? We don't know. There are different theories, and we don't have to worry about this. We'll find out in the Last Judgment. But Pope Benedict makes a very interesting suggestion. I just throw this out just for curiosity's sake. And it's beautiful, actually. In his book, Jesus of Nazareth, but also in a homily that he gave, I think in 2007, on Holy Thursday, he explained that we've come to know that in Israel there were two different calendars, two different liturgical calendars in use. One that was used in the temple, and one that was used by the Essenes. There were different sects of Jews. And the Essene Passover fell a few days before the temple Passover. So we don't know, it's just hypothesis. But perhaps Jesus celebrated the Passover on the Essene calendar, true Passover, different calendar, and he was sacrificed when the temple, in the temple, the lambs were being, and that way he could realize both figures at the same time. Again, something that the divine wisdom, Jesus wanted to institute the Eucharist at a true Passover, because the Passover is the figure of him. But he also wanted to die as the Paschal lambs were being sacrificed. And perhaps he devised a way to realize both of those at the same time. But we don't know.
At the very beginning, you spoke about the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy of Holies, and the three things that were in there, the Ten Commandments, the manna, and the rod. In my haste of taking notes, I missed the first one that was the Ten Commandments. I got the jar of manna was food, and the rod was king.
Right. And the Ten Commandments, so the question is about the Ark of the Covenant. The tablets of the law represent Christ, who's the living Torah. He's that's one of the reasons that he became man, is so that he could not simply show us how to live by giving us commandments written on stone, but he embodies the commandments in his life and his death And so he's the living Torah. Mhm. And likewise in the Eucharist, now when we receive him, we're receiving the living Torah who shows us the way. In other words, who enables us to live the commandments.